Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Let's begin with a simple summary coming from the conversation that covers what we know about the CCP virus to date. The authors of this article explain the fundamental nature of what a virus is, that we know its origins, and to some degree that it's mutating and that these mutations are being monitored in over 100 countries. These monitoring efforts have identified a substantially slower rate of mutation than other comparable viruses. This means the CCP virus is surprisingly stable. Just because the CCP virus is mutating slowly does not mean it is not mutating at all, or that these mutations are not adverse. In fact, some of them can be adverse to the virus, and some of them can be adverse to the human host. The exact nature of which is further explained in the article from the conversation, where they highlight several more important examples. One of these being a mutation which increases infectivity for humans, and another which increases the human body's immune response to the proteins that make up the virion particle. With that sort of background known, we now need to examine the impact we are seeing from the CCP virus in the world, and particularly Europe. Europe is seeing what they are describing as a resurgence of sorts. Spain, Italy, and a few other countries were particularly hard hit by the first wave, and now they're seeing a second. This has led some of the larger cities, such as Madrid, to go into city-wide lockdowns. This means practically no movement of people, and, at least theoretically, no possible way of infecting other people. This mitigates the chances of it becoming a drastically more serious issue, as the number of infected people could have exploded. This is a drastic solution to the problem, but one that has been illustrated as amply necessary by the first wave of infections in Europe. Countries like Spain and Italy had their medical systems practically overwhelmed by the number of infected, who desperately needed services and facilities that were in such high demand that they could not be provided to everyone. Madrid in Spain is not the only example, with England and other countries exhibiting the same sort of behaviours in an effort to curb the spread. We're not just talking about ensuring people don't travel, but that even households are told not to mix. This means neighbours should not visit neighbours, relatives not visiting relatives, and so on. This is there to ensure that the already relatively highly contagious CCP virus can't get established in a new household and then spread from there, as it would be like dominoes. One infected individual can create a cascade of others being infected and carrying on the virus long after the initial infection has been resolved. This situation is being absolutely exemplified in America, particularly within the state of Wisconsin. In Wisconsin, parents are sending their children back to school despite having concerns that they were infected with the CCP virus. In fact, in some cases, they knew the children were infected, yet still sent them to school. The issue here is, as we've reported in past weeks, children are capable of infecting both other children and prospectively taking the disease back home. This means that the school could become a breeding ground for multiple infections spreading from one household to many others. The reason for this is that parents are simply in denial of the practical realities, that their children, although somewhat resilient to the CCP virus, are still open to being infected. In fact, some parents are lying to contact tracing efforts in an effort to simply send their kids back to school. Others are refusing to have their children tested despite children being obviously ill. This means the children aren't going to get any treatment that's appropriate to their condition, and it also puts others at risk. Consider that the next possible solution to this is that if parents aren't willing to act in both theirs and others' best interest, that the entirety of society within certain areas may have to be closed down. This means isolation and quarantine for everybody, much like they're bringing out in Europe. And this is something that the parents seem to be completely oblivious to or deliberately ignorant of. Their actions aren't simply going to be allowed to go on. There will be consequences, and these consequences will be more serious for their decisions now. They're left with one of two choices: either short-term pain for long-term gain, or bury their head in the sand, ignore the issue, and wear much more serious consequences later on that are going to hurt a lot more. The big concern is just who their actions are going to hurt. Other than the fact that whole school districts may have to be closed down, there are certain members of the population who are at greater risk. The question so far has been, why are certain people at more risk? Genetic investigation has linked it to a single Neanderthal-related gene from more than 60,000 years ago. That one stretch of DNA from millennia ago is supposedly responsible for a drastic increase in the severity and duration and need for support if infected by the CCP virus. The gene itself is surprisingly prevalent, with about 50% of people in South Asia having it and about 16% of Europeans. The worrying correlation is that if you have this particular stretch of DNA, you are 3 times more likely to need a ventilator than if you did not have it. This means you're going to have a far more serious issue with infection, far longer recovery period, and far bigger consequences. This is on top of those who have underlying conditions and comorbidities. While on the topic of the CCP virus, we should also look at an interesting but unfortunate case study. The general process for being tested for the CCP virus is to have a nasal swab taken. This is then sent off to a laboratory where nucleic acids are extracted and certain genes are tested for to see if they are present. The process of a nasal swab, while unpleasant, is largely uneventful. In this particular case study, the authors note that one woman happened to have a very rare reaction, or more specifically, her circumstances were incredibly rare, which led to brain fluid leaking from the swab location. Her circumstances are rare, unusual, and likely very specific to her. She had previously been treated for something known as intracranial hypertension. That is, the cerebrospinal fluid had too much present, resulting in it causing stress on the lining of the brain. This was solved by the introduction of a shunt which drained some of the fluid. The problem was a byproduct of this treatment. It created what's known as an encephalocele. That's a small protrusion of that lining from the base of the skull. In this case, it protruded into her nose. When you combine the fact that there is a lining to the brain protruding into the nose, a somewhat rough swab, and you can see how a rupture could occur. Treatment for her condition, both the one that has developed and the original cause, have resulted in her recovering completely. However, it is an important note to make. Any treatment and any procedure, no matter what it is, does carry some small degree of risk, and this is one reason why you are normally given informed consent forms. While talking about a case study of the brain, we should also look at some of the neurological impact that the CCP virus is having. We've previously spoken about the variety of risks that it could pose, and some of the observed issues, such as neurological anomalies and risk of Parkinson's disease. We've also noted that it's had effects on sense of smell. Another possible implication of the CCP virus is that it may be interfering with the sensation of pain. Not sensing pain could have some more serious implications. One of these, and perhaps the most obvious, is that if you don't sense pain, then you may not seek attention from a doctor in time to prevent spreading the disease. Anybody who's had a serious case of influenza knows just how miserable it can be. The process of developing a fever, along with the aches and pains in the body, give you many signals that you are unwell, and that you should either take cold and flu medication, rest and fluids, or, if the case becomes serious, seeing a doctor. Without those sorts of signals from your body, you would simply keep going as normal. Admittedly, a little more tired and quicker to become tired, but you would still be able to continue on. And this appears to be one of the things the CCP virus is doing. By mitigating or blocking some of the pain signals from the body, the people who are infected, more at the lower end of severity than the higher end, are able to continue about their daily lives infecting others. The research underpinning this is very interesting because it looks at the possible application and implications of the protein spike from the CCP virus, not with the ACE2 protein receptor, but instead a different receptor known as neuropilin-1. The possibility is that the protein spike on the CCP virus could allow it to take advantage of both possible structures on cells, and in the case of this study, interfere with the ability to detect and transmit pain and discomfort. Going now from the CCP virus to simply bizarre and unusual case studies, we have one involving a man who died from licorice, specifically black licorice. This occurred in America after the Massachusetts man ate a bag of black licorice each day. Licorice has a number of features to it, one of which is that it is incredibly sweet. The other of which is that in large doses it is poisonous. This is what led to the 54-year-old man's demise. What happened is interesting. Over a period of several weeks he had been eating relatively little else but the black licorice. Licorice is sourced from a root of a plant which produces an interesting chemical called glycyrrhizin. This glycyrrhizin can, in some cases and at high enough doses, reduce the body's potassium levels. Potassium is essential for the heart and other nerves to function. Without the nerves in the heart has no way to keep a proper rhythm, and specifically to keep beating. By reducing the amount of sodium in the body, the man developed a heart arrhythmia and eventually fell unconscious. What makes this particular case study all the more interesting is that many licorice products are not flavored with the licorice root itself. Rather, they are flavored with anise oil, which comes from the anise seed generally. That product does not contain the glycyrrhizin. This means that, at least in theory, he had to have picked the right product with the right flavor and the right compound in it out of a whole variety of others that would have otherwise been safe in the context of this case study. In another somewhat clinical case study related piece of news, the first person to be cured of HIV has just died. The man known as the Berlin patient has died from cancer, which is ironic given that the reason he was cured from AIDS or HIV is that he had cancer in the first place. The medical treatment for the form of cancer he had, known as leukemia, is to have a bone marrow transplant. This is preceded by irradiation of the body. That removes all the blood and bone marrow in the body effectively. Then the body is given new bone marrow from a donor. The HIV virus likes to hide in the bone marrow where it can come out of hibernation and spread. Being in the bone marrow the way it is allows it to avoid the immune system. This means that he both was treated for his leukemia and cured of HIV in two courses of treatment that were incredibly difficult and incredibly dangerous. In other experimental treatment news, a treatment for cancer that doesn't rely on any drugs, as you or I would know them, has passed some of the initial tests. The way this works is that it involves an amino acid called L-phenylalanine. This is an amino acid that cannot be synthesized in the human body. This means we need to get it from other sources, primarily amino-rich foods such as meat, and in some cases dairy products. Cancer cells also need this particular amino acid, much like the rest of the body does. By using a particular small nanoparticle called nanoscopic phenylalanine porous amino acid mimic, researchers were able to trick the cancer cells into taking this up. Then, once they had taken it up, this faux amino acid was able to push those cells into generating reactive oxygen species. Reactive oxygen species, as the name might suggest, are highly reactive, and this can cause damage to the cell very quickly, very efficiently, and is often very tightly controlled. If you are only targeting the cancer cells with this treatment, it means you are causing massive damage to the cancer cells. Theoretically, enough damage that they would no longer be viable and self-destruct, or if not self-destruct, rally enough of the immune system that only would the immune system clear the damaged cells but begin taking an interest in the rest of the cancerous growth. The advantages of this approach over others is that it is relatively specific to cancer, as the way they've designed it is safe for human consumption, or at least safe for human food. This means, at least in theory, it's not going to be hitting unintended or off-target sites. This is the problem we see most frequently with conventional chemotherapy. It hits everything, including the cancer, but this has side effects, hair loss being the most obvious example of it. Another treatment that's experimental, but one that we've mentioned before in part, is the idea of poop transplant. A fecal transplant is somewhat useful, particularly when we're talking about issues where someone has had their GI tract completely cleansed of any bacteria. The process reintroduces what could be called friendly or useful bacteria that populate the GI tract and help to generate otherwise ungeneratable products. The human body is not able to synthesize everything it needs, but in many cases, friendly bacteria within the GI tract can do just that. The current particular study looks at whether or not fecal transplant using milk could achieve the same result with children delivered via C-section. In what is likely a first and somewhat disconcerting study, a proof-of-concept pilot study has used diluted feces from the mother, put into breast milk, and fed to newborn children to populate the infant's GI tract with beneficial bacteria. At least one of the theories underlying why children who are delivered via caesarean section need this extra support is that the mother receives considerable antibiotics after the fact. This can have an effect on her GI tract bacteria and the flora within the child because they would receive some of the antibiotics via breast milk. This means that they have the effect of having the bacteria that are within them removed very early on, and this can have longer-term health effects, or at least there is evidence of this. While on the topic of microbes, we should talk about how the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality has warned the residents of a city not to drink their tap water. This comes after they've identified that the tap water contains a rare amoeba called Naegleria fowleri. Like past videos where we've mentioned similar amoeba, this can have an effect on the brain, and in serious cases, it can actually damage the brain. The way it does this is that it goes up the nasal cavity, gets to the brain, and causes what is known as primary amoebic meningoencephalitis. Encephalitis being inflammation of the brain, and the meningo part being the meninges, or the covering of the brain. Inflaming this puts unnecessary and unwanted pressure on the brain, and can cause significant effects, not the least of which is that increased pressure can damage the brain. Next, we have an interesting study that's trying to figure out just why some people are left-handed, and in this case, how there could be 41 genes linked to this particular phenomena. It is estimated that between 5 and 10% of the population is left-handed. Even fewer than this is ambidextrous. Why then do we have nearly everybody being right-handed? It's thought, at least initially, that it's largely an environmental or cultural phenomena. Many societies use the left hand for their ablutions. This means being right-handed for everything else makes sense. It reduces the possible risk of contaminating various surfaces, tools, food, and so on with bacteria. That only makes so much sense, as it would have required that there be a large part of the population initially that was right-handed, and that the cultural phenomena was universal, but we know that it's not. Therefore, there must be something more fundamental at play here. That's where this study comes in. 41 single DNA changes were linked to being left-handed, 7 more to being ambidextrous. The problem with these findings is that they only were able to account for 12% of the variance. That means there's 88% that is accounted for by other things. And that's the issue here. There's no single gene to start with, but other than there being no single gene, even these large genome-wide association studies haven't been able to track down a single cause. The final item we have for you this week takes us from looking at the very tiny things that are inside our own bodies all the way to space. There's been an ongoing issue with a leak on the International Space Station. Being the International Space Station, you can imagine how a small leak could be a very big issue. There are finite resources on board, specifically those sorts of gases that are both breathable and provide atmosphere. A small loss over a long time of these essential gases, primarily oxygen, could lead to the entire station being unserviceable. This leak was identified back in September of 2019. It's only now been isolated as it takes a long time to be able to figure out just what's happening. The way it's done is very simple. The astronauts isolate all of the other cabins bar the ones that they are in. Then, they begin to repressurize each one in sequence. If they don't observe any significant change in the loss of those essential gases, they know that module on the ISS it doesn't have that leak. The problem is they could not find the leak using this method. Not being able to find it leads to a simple conclusion. The leak must have been in the two modules that they had occupied when they were testing all of the others. It should be possible for the astronauts on board to test these final two compartments. The only caveat to that is that they would need to occupy a particular module built by the Americans that serves the same fundamental purpose. That is, it provides life support, accommodation, oxygen, a kitchen, water, everything they would need to get by while testing these last two compartments. That's great in theory. The problem is the way the ISS is designed has one way in and one way out fundamentally. That is through a docking component. That docking component is where the Soyuz spacecraft attached to it. If the astronauts had to get off of the ISS in a rush, it would be difficult for them to go from the American side of the ISS to the Soyuz spacecraft and back to Earth in a timely manner. That doesn't mean it's not possible, just that preparations would need to be made. Before going through all of that hassle, they are slowly going through and double-checking what they've already looked at in the other modules to ensure that they have not inadvertently missed something. The ISS crew, NASA, and the Russian cosmonaut service aren't going to be stressing about this just yet. They've already had to deal with leaks in the past, although the exact origin and nature of these hasn't exactly been explained. The only definite knowledge is that at some point there was a small 2mm hole in part of the spaceship that was docked to the space station at the time, and that this led to a similar issue where they were losing pressure and leaking out essential gases and resources. These sorts of consumables could be replaced, but the fact that it was occurring and that we don't exactly know why, because, as the Russians said, we know exactly what happened, but we will not tell you anything, isn't exactly encouraging. Hopefully we'll find out what's happening with more detail this time round. That's all the news items we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions you might have below.